this is a new development, that people can become Prime Minister with absolutely no democratic testing of their ideas, with no scrutiny over their policies.
I think there is a risk that the right collectively underestimates the sort of honeymoon period and the bounce that Labour may well get.
When Ahmed was sentenced, he complained about the members of the jury being white. He said that it's fashionable to blame everything on Muslims these days.
There will be activist journalists who work in partnership with opposition parties who oppose reform, and that's a large amount of what's really going on here.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, Deputy Editor of Spiked. No Tom Slater this week, but I am delighted to be joined by one of our favourite returning guests, Spike columnist Luke Gittos.
Hi.
And making his Spike podcast debut, we're delighted to have Ross Kempsell. Welcome. Ross, you're one of the youngest peers in the House of Lords. You were a research director at CCHQ, and you worked in Number 10 as a SPAD. So we're thrilled to get your take on things. So plenty to discuss today. We'll be talking about Andy Burnham's plan for Broken Britain, the grooming gang leader we can't deport, and whether we may have reached peak reform. So Andy Burnham gave one of his first addresses to the nation after being elected as MP for Makerfield. He is poised to enter Downing Street within a matter of weeks.
Imagine good growth in every postcode and hope in every heart.
His big focus in this quite cliche-laden speech was devolution. He says, we want to rewire Britain by devolving power to various mayors, giving power away from Westminster, because that's the place to ensure growth, to ensure better public services, things like that. Ross, I want to come to you first. I mean, do you buy this idea that this is really the big problem with Britain, that the Mayor of Manchester, say, or the First Minister of Scotland doesn't have enough power?
I'm all for increasing the power and authority of local communities over decisions that affect them right in general, as a general principle. The problem is with Andy Burnham and the sort of reinvention of the Labour Party that looks like it's going to take place if he becomes Prime Minister in September, which I think is likely, is that you have to weigh in the balance against that, everything else that he's saying and committing to. And you can't actually reasonably expect to embark on this programme of massive Manchesterism and democratisation of the way that power is distributed in the UK when you have no money to spend. That's the key problem. And if you take into account Burnham's commitments, historical and more recent, including the public commitments that he made during the Makerfield by-election, this is a guy who wants to spend £100 billion renationalising the water industry, according to the government's own estimate. This is a politician who deeply believes and has for more than a decade advocated a land value tax, which would totally change the way that property is taxed in the UK. And I just want to dwell on that in particular for a second, because I think it's the core issue that's actually going to blow up Andy Burnham if he does it. We used to have a land value tax or land taxation in this country in the early 20th century, and it caused the death of the Liberal Party, basically. It was repealed in 1922 because it just doesn't work here. We have a system in the UK where generally property is taxed on the value of buildings, and you pay council tax and stamp duty on transactions. If you want to replace stamp duty with a land value tax, you have to look at the other examples around the world where this has been done. And there's very few developed countries in the world that tax land like that. So there's Estonia, Denmark, Taiwan, and some others. And they all raise, less than 3% and sometimes vastly less of their annual, gross tax revenues from a land value tax. I think it'd be even worse here, because basically what it would mean is suddenly land would become cheaper in the UK, and the value of everybody's properties and any asset that they own would fall. And then future buyers factor that into transactions. So you suddenly make many homeowners poorer. It would have a huge impact on farmers, a huge impact on owners of commercial land. And it's just the kind of totemic policy that I think that whatever Andy Burnham says about moving Number 10 to Manchester, whatever the warm words are and the honeyed words that he wants to pour on his narrative vision, when it comes down to it, He's got a budget to deliver in November where the fiscal envelope is very small. Gilts are running, near 5%, which is global financial crisis kind of levels. None of what he is saying is reality based with where the UK is now, and he's just not being honest about that with the voters, who, by the way, had no opportunity to choose him anyway, other than in Makerfield.
Yeah, that's true. And we have the highest tax burden since the Second World War, as often been pointed out. And finding new spending commitments is going to be they have to be paid for, right? Luke, what did you make of the speech? I mean, are you convinced that devolution is the answer to these Britain's pressing problems?
Well, no. I think the more I read about it, the less I like it. I think firstly what it does is it pretends that the model of success that Andy Burnham created in Manchester, which we should recognise, some really positive reforms, doesn't map onto a strategic leadership for the country. I mean, and it's right that local communities should have a greater say in the things that affect them, but those are micro-level issues like bus fares, the kind of how regularly your litter is collected, etc. I'm not convinced that local communities actually look to their local government for leadership on things like immigration. Like, how do you set a national immigration policy through greater power in local government? It doesn't work. When you look at the kind of issues that Labour are wrestling over, and particularly trying to wrestle political control from reform over, these are national big issue questions: immigration, asylum, law and order. These just aren't things that can be resolved at the moment, or on what Andy Burnham is proposing through more power in local government. I just don't see how it works. I think the second political point here is that it really diffuses political accountability and democratic accountability. So you see this already with the devolved national assemblies, where when there is real problems, for example, with healthcare or education in Scotland or Wales, blame goes back and forth between Westminster and the National Assembly. The idea that it would be a good thing if this was replicated citywide, I mean, I just think it creates a real democratic tension between the local and the national, which is really not very helpful.
And you sort of end up with often one party rule in certain areas, and that leads to and in the worst cases to outright corruption. I mean, you look at what's going on with the SNP in Scotland. Peter Murrell, the chief executive, has just been jailed only recently. You look at a place like Liverpool, for instance. The former mayor there is awaiting trial next year for bribery because again, of course, he protests his innocence, but I think these things tend to happen more when there is very little political context, very little accountability. There's no local media to speak of to hold these leaders to account, and it's not a left-wing thing either. You look at Ben Houchen in Teesside. I mean, he was exonerated of corruption allegations, but there were questions to be asked about some of the money that had been funneled into local projects. So it does seem that it actually is a recipe for less accountability. We do have a much more nationally focused politics. I'm also not convinced that it is going to lead to the kind of growth, or Manchesterism Manchester is obviously in the centre of all this, but a lot of people have looked at some of the data around it and saying actually it doesn't quite add up. That if you look at job growth, for instance, rate of and wage growth, actually Manchester's performed less well than Basildon, than Luton, than Warrington, than Bristol, than Glasgow, about the same as Liverpool with all of their problems that we talked about. So I don't know. I mean, unless we're going to have someone proposing Basildonism as the answer to Britain's problems, maybe that is the way forward. But it does seem like it feels like a comforting narrative. It doesn't feel like it has much substance to it. The left has run out of ideas, and this is the thing they're grasping for at the moment.
I think Luke's absolutely right when he talks about the democratic deficit. So this is a rolling programme of devolution and democratisation that's being proposed by an incoming Prime Minister who was never elected at a general election. And that's the core problem, right? And I lived through, multiple episodes of that as a, insider in the Conservative Party, and it just doesn't work. It doesn't work now. I think the consensus around the way the political system works in the UK, whether or not it's constitutionally designed like this, is now different, and we have a much closer conception of the Prime Minister to a presidential system in practice than we do on paper.
Yeah.
So you have Andy Burnham, who decided to take himself out of national politics at his own kind of volition for many, many years, suddenly re-emerging a man who, in terms of the public's knowledge of his national track record, it's very limited, which, initially I think will be an advantage for Labour. But as soon as he makes a mistake or messes up a budget or, impacts policy in a way that people don't agree with, voters will rightly feel, I think we'll all feel this massive democratic deficit, that at the end of the day, nobody elected this person to be anything other than the MP for Makerfield. And the rest of it is an internal Labour Party process, which is completely out of the control of the vast majority of voters. So that, the answer is, I'm afraid, and I know there's been lots of them, but I think the only solution is to have a general election and to realise that when there is no mandate, the mandate, the question needs to be put back to the people. That's my view.
Yeah, and just on that question of, I think it's a matter of if, not when, Andy Burnham's popularity starts to plummet. I mean, as you say, probably the first budget, maybe the first riot, maybe the first terror attack. But it does feel as if he has been riding high in the polls due to a lack of scrutiny, due to a lack of knowledge about what he's about. He's certainly, to his credit, he does have a lot more charisma than Keir Starmer, although maybe that's not such a difficult hurdle to climb over. I think many people in the Labour Party, whether they think this is going to turn things around completely, certainly feel that this is their last chance to have a stab at winning the next general election. But what do you think?
I was reminded in what Ross was saying there that the roots of devolution, at least in the modern era, was New Labour and the new constitutional settlement under New Labour. So when Tony Blair proposed devolution, it was alongside measures like removing the House of Lords as a court to a Supreme Court across the road in Westminster. It was, but also very significantly for today's purposes, it was signing up and passing the Human Rights Act and bringing us into the European Convention on Human Rights. And at the time, it was seen as a big distribution of power away from Westminster into the hands, firstly, of national assemblies, but as it turns out, also into the judiciary.
Yeah.
And I think what we're perhaps underestimating here is the potential for the new legal powers that will be passed over to these new, any new local community governments, that the powers that will be passed over to them will all be subject to legal review, judicial intervention. So you're seeing this just greater bureaucratization of local political life potentially, which I think could be incredibly harmful. And then I think secondly, the point around, I think most people in the country think it's really weird that Andy Burnham is going to become Prime Minister in the way that he has, and it raises real questions about his democratic standing, and I agree with everything Ross has said there. And I think the deeper question of how this relates to Labour's challenges on national questions, it's clear that the left running out of ideas is definitely true, and it raises a real question around how the battle of ideas will be won in the Labour Party, because what alternative is there now? They've got a very short amount of time before a potential next general election. Andy Burnham didn't take questions after his speech. He's clearly not prepared for a general election where his ideas will be tested. He's faced absolutely no questions in the House of Commons. He won't do before he becomes Prime Minister, as far as I understand. And so he's completely untested. And I think this is a new development that, people can become Prime Minister with absolutely no democratic testing of their ideas, with no scrutiny over their policies. So I think his honeymoon will be very, very short-lived. I'll just quickly say I'm young enough to remember Keir Starmer's honeymoon period. This was only 2 years ago when he won a majority, and you had that swooning, from the bourgeois middle class. And broadly, the things that
literally in some cases, female journalists feeling weak at the knees.
Talking about they'd like to, makes them aroused when they think about Keir Starmer premiership and all that sort of stuff. And I remember before Keir Starmer coming in, all the left-wing journalists saying a competent opposition is coming. Do you remember this before the general election? And the idea was that he was kind of a competent, safe pair of hands. And that's turned out to be, that was incredibly short-lived, wasn't it? The first time he had any real policy shift on like the winter fuel allowance, suddenly things started totally falling apart. So it'll be very interesting to see how long Andy Burnham's honeymoon period lasts, because at the moment it looks like the best thing about him is that he's just not Keir Starmer.
I completely agree. And I can remember vividly on the 2024 general election polling day when the exit poll dropped at 10 p.m. showing that Keir Starmer was going to get a huge majority in the House of Commons. the journalists who were doing the broadcast coverage of that exit poll, a couple of them made literally orgasmic, climactic noises that are etched into my aural memory. And it just betrays
You hear that when you close your eyes at night.
it's something that I often dwell on. And similarly, I can remember when Angela Rayner walked into Downing Street to become Deputy Prime Minister then before she imploded in her own scandal. She had a phone case that was attached to her with a lanyard. And a broadcast journalist who was covering it said, "Have you ever seen anything like that? The Deputy Prime Minister walking into Downing Street with a phone case and a lanyard." Now, this is the quality of the discussion between the elite media class and the elite political class when it comes to the election of sort of, human bollards like Keir Starmer, who if the competition is let's have more charisma and let's find a politician who's more charismatic and inspiring than Keir Starmer, well, it's extraordinary that the Labour Party have had to reach for somebody who's not currently in the front bench or in the front line of politics in order to find that. Having said that, through bitter experience of fighting Labour Party at lots of different elections, whether they're local elections, by-elections, general elections, I think there is a risk on the right that the right collectively underestimates the sort of honeymoon period and the bounce that Labour may well get, because trust me, they're going to get points for ditching Keir Starmer. Starmer's personal unpopularity is pretty extraordinary by the standards of modern prime ministers.
Yeah.
And, as much as all this is true, on the flip side of the pancake, there has to be an electable alternative that offers a vision of hope and offers a vision of change that's actually rooted in something deliverable, that solves all the questions that we're talking about. And we all know what the issues are that the country's facing. I think there's a general consensus on the economy, on immigration. It feels like to me, since the 2024 general election, some of the dividing lines there between the parties have been elided, and broadly there's a sense of what is wrong. So it's incumbent on the opposition parties to step up and provide a workable programme that actually can address that.
Absolutely. And one thing, before we move on quickly, one thing the polling in Burnham's favour is that he's polls very favourably among Green voters. And now, obviously, if the Labour Party wants to win big in general elections, it has to win back its working class base who are defecting to Reform or previously went to the Conservatives and Boris Johnson. But what keeps Labour Party people up at night is the loss to the left and middle class Green voters, and Burnham polls well among them. So that might also give them a bit of a reprieve, might give them a bit of a better chance in the next election, or might also perhaps more nightmarishly lead to a potential coalition if he's seen as someone who can get on with that with those other left parties. So I do want to move on to talk about Shabir Ahmed, and this is the rape gang leader that we cannot deport. He has been personally convicted for over 30 cases of child rape. He was head of the Rochdale gang, which is one of the most prolific in the UK. More than 60 members of that gang have been convicted for sexual crimes, the most horrific crimes imaginable. And yet, legally, it seems, Luke, we're unable to remove him from the country, despite the fact that he's coming out of prison. He's only served half of his prison sentence, as is now customary. He will be able to roam the streets of Britain. I mean, can we really say that we have an immigration system, a border, if that is the case?
It's truly shocking. So the legal issue is that there is an exemption in a piece of law passed in the 1970s that effectively meant that any citizen of a Commonwealth country or a dual citizen of a Commonwealth country who had been in the country for 5 years was effectively barred from deportation. And at the time, it was thought that this measure would give additional status to citizens of the Commonwealth. It reflected their status as Commonwealth countries. But of course, MPs in the 1970s would have no imagination that this would end up protecting a serial rapist from deportation some 50 years later. The first question should be, why wasn't this case looked at official level? why are we only learning about this possibility now? Because if anyone within the Home Office had taken notice of this case, a piece of primary legislation could have repealed this protection very, very quickly.
He was sentenced in 2012, so there's been plenty of time to sort this issue out.
Exactly. There's a lot of time to sort this issue out. So it seems remarkable to me that no one has grasped the nettle on this. And I think part of that is the overall establishment contempt for the victims of the grooming gang scandal. There just isn't the level of interest in protecting their interests as there would be if this was a different kind of victim. Working class girls, the victims of these gangs, just aren't held in the kind of priority that they ought to be. And then but also it just reflects the broader malaise that our immigration and asylum laws face. This isn't an asylum case. He's not an asylum seeker. But the Times reported over the last couple of days a number of other cases involving grooming gang convictees, so people who have been convicted of extremely serious sexual offences in connection with the grooming gangs, who are about to be released and who are fighting their deportation on human rights grounds, saying that they can't be. I mean, it just beggars belief that we're in this situation. And I think it's actually really healthy that over the last 4 or 5 years there's been real scrutiny on our asylum system, because it's difficult without drawing attention to the really egregious cases, the chicken nuggets case, the case involving really serious money launderers and drug dealers that fight their deportation on human rights grounds, etc. It can be really difficult to see what kind of ridiculous outcomes the asylum system leads to, because it's completely impossible to understand for the vast majority of people, because most people aren't going to sit there and read a 75, 80-page judgment of the Upper Immigration Tribunal, which is where these decisions are made. So there is so many holes and pitfalls in our current asylum and immigration system that you're right, Fraser, that effectively we have a border that's very porous and it's extremely difficult to challenge when it's breached.
Yeah. I mean, it's worth stating that not a single one of the convicted Rochdale grooming gang members has been deported. And that's more than 60 people.
Yeah, and it's also worth saying in response to that many of the victims after their trials were told and promised that these individuals would be deported and would leave the country. I'm with Luke on what he said there. I think when you cover all these different bases in the infrastructure of immigration law, it's important to draw that distinction very clearly between different processes. So as Luke rightly said, this individual, Shabir Ahmed, who we're talking about now, is not an asylum case. So if you take the 1971 Immigration Act, which is UK domestic law, which has this provision that's making it impossible apparently to deport him, this is amendable UK domestic legislation.
Yeah.
That there's no question about the ECHR or whether the House of Commons is sovereign over this process. It's completely fixable, and it beggars belief to me that the Labour government, even in its current form, discounting the incoming Andy Burnham, who may take a different tack on this, we don't know, hasn't put forward proposals to fix this massive gaping hole in the way that deportation works. There's another bilateral issue between the UK and Pakistan. There's been several of these cases where Pakistan as a sovereign state is particularly entrenched in refusing deportation proceedings. So obviously, what does the UK have to do? It has to get real with Pakistan and say, look, if you are not going to accept the fact that we are going to deport these horrific rapists back to your country where they came from, to the UK originally, then we're going to withdraw cooperation from you on all the other things that you care about. And this is just the brutal realpolitik of geopolitics. And I'm staggered that the UK government corporately, under any party, whether it's Conservatives or the Labour Party, haven't done more on that. And, just a month ago or something, I was looking actually at some UK government press releases about a ministerial visit to Pakistan that was undertaken by one of my colleagues, a minister in the House of Lords. And all it screams is the relationship is totally business as usual.
Yeah.
So the government has to fix that and shift its mentality and say that we will not have a business as usual bilateral relationship with any country at all that refuses the deportation requests when it comes to deporting these kind of foreign national offenders, and in fact all of them, back to their countries of origin where that is legally proper. Nobody wants this individual in this country. There is a massive degree of public outrage about this. The fact that politicians can't fix something so basic when the law is so easily fixable staggers me. And this is the core issue that I think will be fought out at the next general election.
Absolutely, and I think that question of priorities is really what it comes down to. I mean, you just think about all the effort that was expended to get that Egyptian, dissident who actually turned out to be a mad anti-Semite and pro-terror. Remember Keir Starmer tweeting that it was his government's top priority to get this person who had never set a foot in the UK to come to Britain, versus how they look at the victims of rape gangs. And I mean, it struck me there's kind of in the trial, it's made very clear how these rapists view these women. The judge said explicitly that the fact they weren't of the Pakistani Muslim community was why they looked down on them, why they looked down on them as less than human. The other thing that struck me was that when Ahmed was sentenced, he called the judge a racist bastard. He complained about the members of the jury being white. He said that it's fashionable to blame everything on Muslims these days, and this is after he has been proven to have raped 30 children. I do wonder whether this kind of fashionable discourse around race, around Islamophobia. I mean, clearly it is so widespread that even criminals are picking up for it. Even the least integrated people in Britain, who are rape gang leaders, are noticing that this is actually how we do things here. This is part of our official ideology.
Yeah, I think a lot of people understand how easy it is to weaponize these terms against the police, against the courts, against our government. Terms like Islamophobia, racism. It's very, very easy for them to use that in order to evade their personal responsibility. I mean, the BBC published a report this morning into one of the leading people traffickers into the country. And one thing these reports continually reveal is that the people running these very, very serious criminal networks, these networks that ruin people's lives, generate huge amounts of illegal cash. This guy's meant to be earning, millions of pounds a year on illegal people trafficking. They understand very well that we have a very lenient asylum system. They understand that they will get legal representation for free in the form of a solicitor normally. They understand they will get housing, that the people they are attracting will get housing. You see time and time again them using the words that we talk about in terms of the weaknesses of our asylum system to kind of justify their illegal project. That's why Britain is such an attractive proposition for these illegal smugglers. It's because they understand and know that once asylum seekers reach these shores, they're going to be given a framework of reasonable support that they would just not expect elsewhere. That's why they're crossing the sea from France into the United Kingdom.
And he himself has applied for asylum.
And he's an asylum seeker.
So he's now calling himself an asylum seeker, which is quite extraordinary.
And in my view, the Home Office can say what it likes about exclusion zones, supervision orders, the fact that when these vile monsters are released from prison, they're under 24/7 supervision. We all know that system doesn't work, because even when they're in a Category A prison and they're actually in prison, the victims of grooming gangs live in fear and live in hiding, even when these people are in prison itself, because members of the wider community are mobilized and set on them to harass them and to intimidate them and to try to keep them in silence about these crimes. And immigration reform is important, but actually, from my experience, I think something deeply important here is foreign policy. And the real reason why many of these cases come to the point that they come to is there's no UK Prime Minister or Foreign Secretary who's willing to sit across the table from their counterparts from a third country like Pakistan and get real with them across the negotiating table. And do you know what? Knowing that bilateral relationship fairly well, the government of Pakistan would actually respect that, because at the end of the day, the UK is a net contributor to many of these countries where FNOs come from. We have a huge amount more geopolitical and economic capital than those states. Let's be brutally honest about it. So we should negotiate and say, you cannot continue to have British foreign aid we're going to withdraw our support for you in international organizations. We're going to stop talking about all the issues that affect you unless you play by the rules that you should have signed up to, which is to accept FNOs back into your country who have been convicted of crimes in the UK. And it's extraordinary that the UK doesn't do that amongst developed countries. It's a completely different position to the way that the UK operates than many, many of its sort of comparator states, obviously the United States, and indeed many countries in the European Union take a much tougher approach. And I think it is actually about the fact that when ministers sit there and have those kind of conversations, they go into the room generally having been briefed only on all of the issues that are positive for that third state, and they are timid and they're weak and they don't raise the reality of the relationship. Because the issue with FNOs, whatever you think more broadly about overseas development aid or the relationship that the UK should have with developing countries or mid-tier powers around the world, the biggest barrier to getting anything done in that relationship is these kind of issues, because it creates massive domestic unpopularity and a huge, rightly and obviously, a huge amount of anger towards those countries themselves and their governments in the way that they operate. So even if you're a sort of dyed-in-the-wool liberal who thinks that the overseas development budget should be increased, it's in your interest to fix these problems, and the UK could absolutely do it with the right leadership.
Every time you open a broadsheet newspaper, you'll probably read the question, has Reform UK peaked? And I think a lot of the time it is more wishful thinking than necessarily evidence-based. But there have been a couple of stories recently that might suggest that Reform is not quite going, or certainly not increasing its poll lead in the way that that it should if it wants to be on track to win the next election, at least to have a majority. So, we've seen 2 by-elections in a row have not gone Reform's way, even though they've been competitive in them. And also there are some of the scandals surrounding Nigel Farage, such as the £5 million donation from a crypto billionaire. And there have also this week questions been raised about his £4 million property portfolio. Ross, I mean, do you think Reform has been derailed, or as I said in my intro, is it just wish fulfillment? Is it just a desire to see them be derailed that is generating this question around peak Reform?
I don't think we've hit peak Reform. And I mean, it just depends what evidence you look at. So, Reform did win the Runcorn and Helsby by-election last year. They are maintaining an aggregate poll lead through hundreds of polls now, stretching over, multiple years where they've been the highest polling party. So I think anybody on the right or the left who underestimates Reform and the support that there is deeply across the country is probably deluding themselves. Having said that, Makerfield was always going to be a challenging seat. It's a seat that I never reasonably thought Reform had a hope of gaining. And the thing about parliamentary by-elections, when they come up in the middle of a parliament, they're always read as a national verdict on what's happening in Westminster, but we all know that that's not really the case. And you have to do a really deep seat-by-seat analysis to understand what actually drives results there. On the media's treatment of Nigel Farage, I mean, at the end of the day, if Nigel Farage has multiple properties in his property portfolio, who cares? Who cares about that? I don't think voters for a second really care about that. There's a lot of studies of how politicians are perceived, and everybody, pretty much across every demographic, perceives every politician, whether they're a left-wing politician or a right-wing politician, they over-index how wealthy they are in their estimation, and they over-index their moral degree of corruption or whatever else it is. Everybody thinks that politicians are bent.
Yeah.
So I don't put any faith in this kind of narrative. I think what is actually happening is there is a deep-seated fear in the top of the liberal media establishment that Reform is doing so well. And what we are going to see, and I think it's only just started, is a long and vicious campaign from certain newspapers, certain broadcast outlets, where journalists act as activists through their journalism. Not that, by the way, I think there's anything wrong with that. I just think that's the reality of the way that the system works. Some elements of the bureaucratic state will join in that. And it's the same problem fundamentally that I recognise that the Conservatives faced, in the run up to 2019, when the forces who just deeply institutionally oppose that kind of politics, and around that time the main issue was still Brexit, so it had that layer. This is gonna get bigger and bigger. It's not going to go away, and part of it is the reality of reform coming up against what it means to experience that level of national media scrutiny in this country. But let's not fool ourselves. Part of it is also a campaign. It's a campaign that is cooked up around the dinner party table for the kind of parties that we probably don't get invited to. Although, I mean, I don't know, you may well. And it's concerted. And there will be activist journalists who work in partnership with opposition parties who oppose reform, and that's a large amount of what's really going on here.
Yeah, Luke, would you have a similar take? It does seem as if they are spooked by reform, and unless Andy Burnham really turns things around, they will continue, I think, to be the largest party. And even I'm sure a lot of people in the liberal media who hated the Tory government probably wish for the return of the Tories as the official, or as the leading opposition.
Yeah, I think one thing reform would be very unwise to underestimate is the risk of tactical voting against them across a number of different constituencies, but also the fact that there might be huge chunks of working class people that would never vote for Nigel Farage in a general election. That's a real risk, because Farage can be a popular political figure. He can draw people's affections for the way that he conducts himself. But unless his party have an ideological, an ideology, something to give to the public that makes them want to vote for them in a general election, there could be real problems. So I think reform do need to now start asking themselves the difficult ideological questions, the difficult policy questions that perhaps they've been a bit fluffy over. I'm thinking specifically of things like asylum and immigration. It's perfectly sensible that they haven't thought out a complete policy platform yet. You wouldn't expect that at this stage. But at the moment, Zia Youssef speaks a lot about the level of deportations they want to achieve. He speaks a lot about the mechanisms by which they'll achieve a certain number of deportations within a particular time. But actually, when you look at the British public's thinking on this, they don't just want people deported for the sake of it. There's more substance to it. They're concerned around protecting the rights of people that have been here for a long time, people who've come here from the Windrush generation, for example. And so reform have to spell out things like, what do you mean by here illegally? Because actually what we saw with the Windrush scandal is that all sorts of people were caught up in the here illegally bracket that the British public definitely don't want deported, people who have been here for decades but who happen to not have the right paperwork and things. These are the kind of really tough questions that reform are going to have to answer. And the risk for them is twofold. One, that the British public don't like their answer and that therefore do coalesce around any party that isn't reform in enough constituencies to make any majority impossible. But two, it fractures the vote on the right, because the pressure from Restore is real, and I think didn't have the impact that people thought it would have in Makerfield, but could have an impact on some marginal seats elsewhere. They're going to have to set out their ideological project for the country. They haven't done that yet. But what hasn't gone anywhere is the coalition that all parties are fighting over. It's the coalition that won the Brexit vote. It's the coalition that gave Boris Johnson his majority. It's this, what you might call working class, socially conservative bloc. Call it the Red Wall, call it whatever you want. But the main parties are still fighting over how to win that block of the country. And reform may have the answers, but I think that the risk for them is that to date, they've been trading on that momentum. The momentum is behind that movement, that block of voters. They're the ones who want to see change. They're the ones that are pushing certain issues to the public debate that haven't been in the public debate for a long time. But reform now have to reckon with that coalition. They have to be honest with them about what they want. They have to put forward the ideas that are going to win them over. So I actually think it'd be useful for people who support reform and want them to do well to be on their guard at this moment, because the risks are real.
And finally, Ross, Luke mentioned Restore there. It's very easy to get through a whole podcast without mentioning the Conservative Party these days as well. How do you see the other contenders on the right? Where do you see them coming in? And we'll end with that.
So I kind of acknowledge what Luke said there, although I take a slightly, I view things through a slightly different lens, having kind of run election campaigns. So I think Restore are largely irrelevant, and I understand Reform's anxieties because they fear bleeding voters from their own base to Restore. But there's no real evidence, and we just had a real-world test case in the Makerfield by-election where Restore underperformed in a seat that was actually very favourable to them historically. You couldn't really have come up with a seat that Restore would have had a better shot in. And they deployed activists and they spent money, and nothing happened. So
fewer votes than the BNP got, I think, in 2010 or when they're at their
correct.
Yeah.
And that is an historically favourable seat for the BNP relatively, although, you know, the track record of the BNP in this country tells you everything you need to know, which is that it's a party that has barely ever produced any kind of meaningful result whatsoever. So I think there is a risk, actually, that Reform strategically over-index how much they need to think about Restore. Reform should be thinking about what their dividing lines are with the Labour Party, because as it stands, in the current polling situation, all other things being equal, the next general election will be a battle between the Labour Party and Reform to form the UK government. So I'm not saying that they should not work on these issues at all, but they should spend the vast majority of their time really deeply understanding what they think about Andy Burnham and Labour policy and what the dividing lines are for a campaign. On policy development, I'm kind of less worried about that. I think Reform understand from the people I speak to, I think they understand the importance of policy development and getting their ducks in a row on policy. I'm much more concerned about how they operate tactically, because in a general election, there are two kind of constituencies, to use a term, that really matter. There's the country, which is, you know, very varied battlegrounds where you have to understand deeply how your politics moves in different areas across a huge battleground. But there's also the Westminster class of opinion formers, and the same in the devolved administrations, who set the agenda of what is talked about on broadcast and in the air war. So those are two different constituencies concerned largely with two different sets of priorities. And the reality is that you have to be able to win or deal with at least both constituencies. And I think Reform are well ahead in much of the country, and rightly a lot of their attention is there. I think when it comes to dealing with the completely different way that elite opinion is formed in the UK, I think that is something to be very concerned about, because ultimately the formers of elite opinion inform the agenda, for example, of the BBC, which is a huge factor. They can shape perceptions, and they know what they're doing when they do that. So you have to have this strategy that manages to deal with both. And I'm sure it's something they're thinking about deeply. But this was the institutional strength of the Conservative Party, because it had relationships with elite opinion formers, where even if those elite opinion formers weren't at all conservative themselves, and certainly weren't pro-Brexit for the large part, they felt some degree of enfranchisement in the political project that was being put forward at the general election. And that is a kind of frustrating and suboptimal piece of work, but all political parties have to do it to be truly competitive. Otherwise, they lose a grip on what is being said about them, and eventually that bleeds into broader perceptions.
Well, thank you, Ross. Thank you, Luke, and thank you to everyone at home. That's it from the Spike Podcast this week. There's no Spike podcast unlocked, but we do have plenty of exclusive stuff for you to watch from our Spike Summit. There are still panels that are behind a paywall that you can access now via the link below in the show notes. Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spike website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.